everyone, welcome back to another video. Last time we left off with the turn of the tide, talking about the more second half of the American Civil War, and some of the things that went into that, things like Sherman and Grant, and the Battle of Gettysburg as well. But we are now on to triumph and tragedy. In the Eastern Theater, Grant and Lee met in a series of battles. In the West, General Thomas defeated General John Hood. In the South, Sherman marched through Georgia from Atlanta to the sea, and then into South Carolina. At long last, Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, which practically ended the war. Lincoln's second inaugural address, with victory in sight, held out a promise of reconciliation to the South. In Congress, he opposed the vindictiveness of the congressman's attitude and proposed Reconstruction, state by state, as soon as 10% of the voters were willing to take an oath of allegiance. His conciliatory plans were defeated by his death. While he was at ease in his box in Ford's Theater in Washington, the box was entered by a fanatical actor, John Wilkes Booth, who shot him. The assassin leaped to the stage, injuring his leg and shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis." The South is avenged. Booth was eventually hunted down and shot, and a few fellow conspirators tried and executed. Mourning in the North was general, but the greatest injury had been inflicted on the South. Vice President Andrew Johnson, who now became president, was a Union Democrat from Tennessee. He honestly intended to carry out Lincoln's conciliatory policies, but he had neither Lincoln's tact nor the prestige of being the man who won the war. His chief opposition came not from the Democrats, but from radical Republicans who wanted to reconstruct the South on a basis of equal rights for the freedmen. By the three Civil War amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th, the former slave states were everywhere. The former slaves, I should say, were everywhere, were given freedom. Then civil rights, and finally the suffrage. Yes, so Lincoln being shot, one of the biggest downsides and destructions of what could have been, really. Obviously, we don't know fully what could have been. If Lincoln was president, would the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment ever have been passed? Hard to say. The 13th for sure. I do believe Lincoln would have passed the 13th Amendment, but the 14th and the 15th? Hard to say. We just don't know. Lincoln would have liked to have passed them, sure, but would he have seen it as politically viable? I don't know. It's really hard to say. I think that there is a big possibility for it, yes. Lincoln would have liked them and would have wanted them to pass. But either way, they do pass, and so we don't have to worry about the what if. We can worry about the what did. And they did pass, thankfully, for all of these former slaves. Um, it really is interesting to look at Andrew Johnson as president. Andrew Johnson, realistically, not one of the better presidents we've ever had, probably one of the worst. Not necessarily because he didn't want to do what Lincoln did, but like they said, he just wasn't Lincoln. He wasn't Lincoln. He maybe wanted to do these things, but it doesn't matter what he wanted to do. He was opposed by radical Republicans. He also would butt heads with people. He tried to fire all of Lincoln's staff, which was within his right, but uh, the Congress, being against him, like I said, made a law that said, "Oh, you couldn't do that." And so when he did it, when he fired some people, they said, "Oh, we got you." And then he's the first president to ever be um, impeached, or at least on an impeachment trial. And he was within his rights. The Supreme Court later said, no, Andrew Johnson was within his rights, and he was. He should have been able to fire whoever he wanted to. It's his cabinet. Just saying. But yeah, still definitely one of the worst presidents. Not necessarily fully because it was his fault, but in some ways it was. Reconstruction under him does not go well. It just doesn't really happen. And then when Grant comes in, Reconstruction kind of happens, but it starts to falter under Grant even. And the the care of the American people just isn't there anymore. So, and kind of how it was all handled. If it was handled a little better, maybe things would have been a little differently, but we'll never know. We don't live in that world. We live in the world we live in. So, but now let's look at the pictures here. In this picture here is troops in the trenches at Petersburg, Virginia, in 1865. The siege of that town lasted from the summer of 1864 until the 2nd of April, 1865. The siege of Petersburg lasted quite a while. Yeah, trench warfare, I said it in the last video. Trench warfare gets very common in the end of the Civil War. It's very effective for defense. People had done trench warfare, obviously, for a long time, but it's just much more effective with modern guns. And so, I mean, you can see and this will be kind of like a prelude to what a lot of the tactics will be for the First World War. They'll look at the American Civil War and see a lot of that. Oh, very interesting. On the picture over here, Grant had arrived at Petersburg in June 1864. The Union attacks had failed, and Grant settled down to siege and trench warfare. Yeah, the original intent was to take Petersburg quick, but obviously it doesn't happen. And could it have ever really happened? No, probably not. They weren't going to give up Petersburg so easily. And I mean, the fact that the siege doesn't take nearly as long as you probably would expect kind of shows that at least they were doing something right. Grant, obviously not a stranger to sieges, but still, I'm sure he was glad to be over with Petersburg and be over with this war at long last. At the left is the Andersonville prison camp in 1865. This Confederate prison in Georgia contested of a long stockade through which ran a small stream. In an area of only 26 acres, the number of prisoners often rose to over 30,000. Poor food, bad sanitary conditions, and exposure took a toll of some 13,000 known dead. The grand total was probably higher. Yeah, there's a lot of these prison camps, not just in the South, but in the North as well. And these people, I mean, it's just not good conditions. It's just not. There are some in Maryland as well. And you can just see, even today, it's like, they're just not good. Sometimes we're in swamps and things like that, just where people weren't going to be. So, doesn't necessarily help, right? Not really. At the bottom here is the building at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, where Lee and Grant met the 9th of April, 1865, and Lee surrendered his command of the Army of Northern Virginia. So Appomattox Courthouse, funny enough, the guy that owned this house when the war started, he lived near where the war started. And then it's just like it's frustrating him, so he moves south, goes to Appomattox Courthouse, goes all the way down there, and he's like, okay, we're never gonna be on the front line again. Look, we're moved far away, and then literally the war ends in his house. So it's just kind of funny. Tries to get away, but obviously the war didn't technically end here. It doesn't end for a little bit longer. There's some Confederates out in Texas and things like that. And there's still some fighting out west. But in the grand scheme of things, the war had more or less ended by this point. At the right here is the victorious Union Army returning home in triumph. Yeah, like you think a lot of these guys, hey, look, we won, we did it, we won the war, we brought back the Union, you could say. I know I have an ancestor myself who fought in the Civil War in the Union, so I'm sure he had the same idea. But it probably wasn't, it wasn't just like with any war. You return and it's just like you're just tired from all that you had to witness and do and things like that. It's just tiring. To the soul, not necessarily to the body as much. It is to the body, but more to the soul. Below is the assassination of Abraham Lincoln 5 days after the end of the war. He opened the harsh era of Reconstruction. Had Lincoln lived, there is reason to believe that the United States would have been spared much of the bitterness that was a legacy of the war. Yeah, a lot of people believe that, me being one of them. I think if Lincoln had lived, would a lot of the bitterness have been? Probably not. There would have still been some bitterness, of course. It's impossible for there not to have been. Just realistically, what this was, people were going to be upset. But Lincoln had the political capital and the political know-how to be able to handle this a lot better than Andrew Johnson was able to. Not to say Andrew Johnson couldn't have in a, let's say, a world where he's president during this and he's the one that wins. He could have. He would have had the political capital. But it still wouldn't have worked like it would have worked with Lincoln. Lincoln was a expert politician. He knew exactly what he could do, what he could not do. He knew a lot of things, and he was also very liked and things like that. So he really could have handled things a lot better. Had John Wilkes Booth not done this, things would have maybe been a lot better. But that's going to do it for this video. If you guys liked the video, leave a like. If you have any reason to improve on these videos, leave a comment down below. I just appreciate your feedback. And as always, subscribe. It really does help out the channel. Thank you.